In the winter of 1886, a single ledger book, hidden beneath the floorboards of Providence's Ravenhill Orphanage, contained entries that would make even the most hardened investigators sick to their stomachs. Children's names listed alongside prices, ages marked like livestock specifications, and delivery dates to textile mills scattered across Rhode Island. What Mary Sullivan discovered in those yellowed pages revealed a trade so horrific that it had operated in plain sight for over a decade, turning society's most vulnerable into nothing more than commercial inventory. But before we dive deeper into this dark chapter of Providence's industrial past, I want you to do something for me. If stories like this fascinate you as much as they do me, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss our investigations into America's hidden histories. Also, I'm curious, where in the world are you listening from? Drop a comment below telling me your city and country. I love hearing from our global community of mystery enthusiasts. Now let's uncover what really happened behind the seemingly charitable walls of Ravenhill Orphanage. According to the fragmented records that survived and the whispered accounts passed down through Providence's working-class neighborhoods, the truth about what transpired at Ravenhill began to emerge only through the persistent efforts of one woman who refused to look the other way. Providence in 1886 stood as one of New England's most rapidly industrializing cities. The Blackstone River powered dozens of textile mills, their brick smokestacks piercing the gray winter sky like monuments to America's manufacturing ambitions. The city's population had swelled to over 130,000 residents, many of them recent immigrants seeking work in the ever-expanding factory system that defined Rhode Island's economy. Along the steep hills that rose from the Providence River, grand Victorian mansions housed the mill owners and textile barons who had built their fortunes on the tireless work of thousands of laborers. But just a few miles south, in the shadow of these industrial palaces, sat Ravenhill Orphanage, a three-story brick building that had been converted from a failed boarding house in 1871. The orphanage occupied a peculiarly isolated position on the outskirts of the city's Elmwood neighborhood. Surrounded by a wrought iron fence that had begun to rust in the New England weather, the building presented an austere facade to the world. Its narrow windows, many of them barred, gave the impression of an institution more concerned with containment than care. The sign at the front gate, painted in fading black letters, simply read, "Ravenhill, Home for Displaced Children, Esters 1871, Agnes M. Raven, Directress." Mary Sullivan had arrived at Ravenhill on a bitterly cold February morning, her leather medical bag clutched tightly in her gloved hands. At 28, she possessed both the nursing credentials from Boston City Hospital and the determination of someone who had seen enough suffering to want to make a difference. Her appointment as the orphanage's head nurse represented what she hoped would be her opportunity to provide proper medical care to children who had been abandoned by circumstance or tragedy. The job posting in the Providence Journal had been brief, but compelling. Experienced nurse sought for charitable institution caring for displaced children. Good Christian character essential. Competitive wages. Apply in person to Mrs. Agnes Raven. What had drawn Mary to respond wasn't just the promise of steady employment, but the chance to work with children who desperately needed advocates in their lives. Agnes Raven, the orphanage's director, had presented herself during Mary's interview as a woman of stern but necessary discipline. Approaching 60, Mrs. Raven carried herself with the rigid posture of someone accustomed to absolute authority. Her grey hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her black dress, while well-made, seemed designed more to intimidate than to comfort. When she spoke about the children in her care, her tone carried the detached efficiency of someone discussing livestock rather than young human beings. "We house between 40 and 50 children at any given time," Mrs. Raven had explained during Mary's orientation. Ages range from 5 to 15. Most arrive here through the courts after being found abandoned or orphaned. Some are surrendered by families who simply cannot provide for them during these difficult economic times. The children Mary encountered on her first day seemed unusually subdued for youngsters living in a communal setting. They moved through their daily routines with a mechanical precision that suggested strict discipline, but also something else. A pervasive atmosphere of fear that hung over the institution like morning fog. During meals, conversation was minimal. During study periods, the silence was so complete that the sound of a dropped pencil seemed to echo through the room. Mary's medical examination of the children revealed concerning patterns. Many showed signs of malnutrition, despite the orphanage's claims of providing adequate meals. Several of the older boys bore calluses on their hands that seemed inconsistent with the light chores described in the orphanage's daily schedule. Most troubling were the gaps in the medical records. Entire months where no entries had been made, as if dozens of children had simply vanished from the institution's rolls without explanation. On the night of March 15, 1886, Mary's growing concerns about Raven Hill crystallized into stark reality. She had been working late in the infirmary, updating medical records and preparing medications for the following day, when she heard the unmistakable sound of children crying somewhere in the building's lower levels. The sound was muffled, as if coming from beneath the main floor, but the distress in those young voices was unmistakable. Mary set down her pen and moved quietly toward the source of the sound, her soft-soled nursing shoes making no noise on the polished wooden floors of the orphanage's main corridor. Following the sound led her to a door she had never seen opened during her 3 weeks at the institution. Located near the building's rear staircase, the door bore no markings and had always appeared to be some sort of storage closet. But tonight, a thin line of lamplight showed beneath its frame, and the crying was definitely coming from whatever lay beyond it. Mary pressed her ear to the door and heard not just the weeping of children, but the low, urgent voices of adults. Mrs. Raven's distinctive tone was clearly audible, along with at least 2 male voices Mary didn't recognize. The conversation was too muffled to make out specific words, but the tone suggested some sort of business transaction was taking place. "The smaller ones adapt better to the machinery," one of the male voices was saying, "especially the girls. They're more docile, and their fingers are nimble enough for the fine work." Mrs. Raven's response was equally chilling. "I have 6 that match your specifications exactly, ages 7 to 10. All healthy enough for factory work, the usual arrangement regarding payment and discretion." Mary felt her blood freeze as the implications of what she was hearing began to sink in. She remained pressed against the door, hardly daring to breathe as the conversation continued. "What about families asking questions?" the second male voice inquired. "We can't afford any investigations." "These children have no families," Mrs. Raven replied with casual indifference. "That's why they're here, and our records show they were transferred to other institutions for better opportunities. No one ever follows up on paperwork from an orphanage." The sound of footsteps approaching the door sent Mary scrambling back to the infirmary, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain it could be heard throughout the building. She managed to return to her desk and resume her paperwork, just as the door at the end of the corridor opened and 3 figures emerged into the lamplight. Mrs. Raven was accompanied by 2 men Mary had never seen before. Both were well-dressed in the manner of successful businessmen, but their faces carried the hard expressions of individuals accustomed to making decisions based purely on profit margins. They exchanged quiet words with Mrs. Raven near the front entrance before departing into the cold March night. The next morning brought a development that confirmed Mary's worst fears. During the breakfast count, she noticed that 4 children who had been present the previous evening were nowhere to be seen. When she discreetly asked the other children about their missing dormitory mates, she was met with the same response from each child: wide, frightened eyes and hurried denials that anyone was missing at all. Mrs. Raven, when questioned about the absent children, provided smooth explanations that she had clearly prepared in advance. Young Thomas and his sister were transferred to a lovely family in Connecticut, she explained, and the Morrison children have been placed with relatives who were recently located in Boston. Wonderful opportunities for all of them. But Mary had seen the fear in the remaining children's eyes. She had heard the business-like discussion of specifications and payments, and she knew with growing certainty that something far more sinister than charitable placement was happening at Ravenhill Orphanage. The weeks following that terrible night in March transformed Mary's understanding of the institution where she worked. What had initially appeared to be a somewhat strict but functioning orphanage revealed itself as something far more sinister, a carefully orchestrated operation that treated vulnerable children as nothing more than commercial commodities. Mary began keeping her own careful records, noting the comings and goings of children with a precision that Mrs. Raven's official ledgers deliberately lacked. The pattern that emerged was both consistent and horrifying. Every 2 to 3 weeks, a small group of children would simply vanish from the orphanage, their disappearances explained away with tales of adoptions, family reunifications, or transfers to other institutions. But Mary's discreet inquiries revealed the truth behind these fabrications. Letters to the institutions where children had supposedly been transferred received responses indicating that no such transfers had ever occurred. Adoption agencies in Providence and surrounding cities had no records of children being placed from Ravenhill, and the families who had allegedly been reunited with their children proved to be entirely fictional when Mary attempted to verify their existence. The children themselves lived under a regime of terror that ensured their silence and compliance. Those who asked questions about their missing friends faced punishments that ranged from withheld meals to solitary confinement in the orphanage's basement chambers. The older children, those approaching their 15th birthdays and thus nearing the age when they would normally be expected to leave the institution, displayed a particular kind of fear that suggested they understood exactly what fate awaited them. During her 4th week at Ravenhill, Mary discovered the basement chambers where children were held before their transfers. Hidden behind what appeared to be a wall of storage shelves, a narrow staircase led to a series of small rooms that had clearly been designed for confinement rather than habitation. Each room contained only a straw mattress and a bucket, with heavy wooden doors that could be locked from the outside. The discovery came about when Mary was searching for medical supplies that Mrs. Raven claimed were stored in the basement. While moving boxes of outdated pharmaceuticals, she noticed that one section of shelving didn't align properly with the wall behind it. A careful examination revealed hinges hidden along the left edge of the shelving unit, allowing the entire section to swing open like a concealed door. The staircase beyond was narrow and steep, leading down to what had clearly once been the building's original cellar. But the space had been extensively modified with wooden partitions and barred doors that transformed it into a series of holding cells. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and human waste, and the walls bore scratches and markings that told of desperate attempts to escape or simply to mark the passage of time. In one of the cells, Mary found evidence that chilled her to the bone. Children's drawings scratched into the wooden walls. Simple figures of families, houses with windows and smoke rising from chimneys, and names carved with fingernails or makeshift tools. Tommy Morris, age 8, from Boston. Sarah Kelly wants to go home. Mama, please find me. But it was what Mary discovered in Mrs. Raven's private office that provided the final, undeniable proof of the horrors being perpetrated at the orphanage. Using a set of keys she had quietly borrowed during one of Mrs. Raven's rare absences from the building, Mary gained access to a locked filing cabinet that contained the true records of Raven Hill's operations. The filing cabinet in Agnes Raven's office contained documents that revealed the full scope of an operation that had been systematically exploiting children for over a decade. Mary's hands trembled as she examined folder after folder of correspondence, contracts, and financial records that treated human beings as nothing more than units of commercial inventory. The centerpiece of this horrific collection was a leather-bound ledger book that contained what could only be described as a sales catalogue. Each page was divided into columns: name, age, physical description, health status, skills, and price. The entries were written in Mrs. Raven's precise handwriting, documenting the systematic sale of children to textile mills throughout Rhode Island and southern Massachusetts. Margaret O'Brien, age 9, small build, excellent health, quick learner, $45. Delivered to Pawtucket Cotton Mills, April 1885. James Crawford, age 12, strong constitution, previous factory experience, $60. Delivered to American Woolen Company, May 1885. Page after page contained similar entries, each representing a child whose life had been reduced to a simple business transaction. The correspondence files revealed the network of mill owners and factory supervisors who participated in this trade. Men who presented themselves as pillars of Providence's business community had been purchasing children like livestock, with detailed negotiations over ages, physical capabilities, and prices. The letters discussed the children's suitability for different types of factory work, with the same casual tone that might be used to evaluate horses or farming equipment. One letter from a mill owner in Woonsocket was particularly explicit about the nature of these arrangements. The children you provided last month have proven most satisfactory. Their small statures allow them to move easily between the machinery, and they require minimal supervision once properly trained. I am prepared to accept 6 more children of similar ages, with the understanding that our previous agreements regarding discretion and documentation remain in effect. Mary discovered that the network extended far beyond simple child labor. Mills that purchased children from Raven Hill maintained their own housing compounds, where the young workers were kept in conditions that amounted to imprisonment. The children worked 12 to 14-hour shifts, 6 days a week, received minimal food and medical care, and were threatened with severe punishment if they attempted to escape or contact the outside world. The financial records showed that Mrs. Raven had been generating substantial personal income from these sales. Over the course of 10 years, she had sold at least 200 children, with prices ranging from $30 for the youngest to $75 for older children with proven work experience. The total amount exceeded $10,000, more money than most skilled workers in Providence would earn in 20 years. But perhaps most chilling were the documents that revealed what happened to children who became unable to work. A series of death certificates, all bearing the signature of a single physician, documented the deaths of dozens of children from industrial accidents and sudden illness. The dates of these deaths corresponded exactly with notes in Mrs. Raven's ledger about children who had been returned as defective or no longer suitable for service. Mary realized she was looking at evidence of murder on an industrial scale. Children who became injured, ill, or rebellious were simply eliminated to prevent any possibility of their stories reaching the authorities. Their deaths were covered up by a complicit doctor who provided false death certificates, and their bodies were disposed of in unmarked graves that would never be connected to the orphanage. As Mary photographed the most damning documents with a small camera she had borrowed from a photographer friend, she heard footsteps in the corridor outside Mrs. Raven's office. Working quickly, she returned the files to their original positions and locked the cabinet, but she knew her time was running out. The evidence she had uncovered was too extensive and too horrifying to keep secret, but she also knew that exposing the truth would put her own life in immediate danger. The morning after Mary's discovery in Mrs. Raven's office, the atmosphere at Raven Hill seemed to shift in ways that made her increasingly certain that her clandestine investigation had been detected. Mrs. Raven's usually cold demeanor became actively hostile, and Mary noticed that her movements throughout the building were being monitored by staff members who had previously paid her little attention. During the children's breakfast, Mary observed Mrs. Raven engaged in quiet conversation with two men she recognized from the correspondence files, mill supervisors who had been regular purchasers of children from the orphanage. Their presence at the institution during normal business hours suggested that another transfer was being arranged, but the timing seemed rushed compared to the careful planning that had characterized previous operations. Mary's fears were confirmed when she overheard Mrs. Raven speaking with her assistant in the hallway outside the infirmary. "The new nurse has been asking too many questions," Mrs. Raven was saying. "I think it's time we considered whether her services are still required here." The implication was clear. Mary had become a liability that threatened the entire operation. She realized that her own disappearance could easily be arranged and explained away, just as the children's had been. A tragic accident, a sudden illness, or simply a decision to seek employment elsewhere, any of these explanations would satisfy the minimal oversight that Raven Hill received from city authorities. That evening, Mary made the decision that would determine whether she lived to expose the truth or became another victim of the orphanage's systematic cruelty. She waited until the building had settled into its usual nighttime quiet, then carefully made her way back to Mrs. Raven's office. This time, she planned to remove the most damning evidence from the building entirely, regardless of the risk of discovery. Using her borrowed keys once again, Mary opened the filing cabinet and removed the leather-bound ledger that contained the sales records. She also took a selection of the most explicit correspondence and the death certificates that documented the murder of children who had become inconvenient to the operation. These documents would provide irrefutable proof of what had been happening at Raven Hill, but only if she could get them to the authorities before Mrs. Raven realized they were missing. As Mary prepared to leave the office, she heard the sound that had first alerted her to the truth about Raven Hill, children crying in the basement chambers. But tonight, the sound carried a different quality, not just fear and sadness, but the desperate terror of children who knew they were about to be taken away forever. Mary realized that another group of children was being prepared for sale, and that tomorrow morning would bring their disappearance from the orphanage rolls. She faced an impossible choice. She could escape with the evidence she had gathered and hope to save future victims, or she could attempt to rescue the children who were currently imprisoned below, knowing that such an attempt would almost certainly result in her own capture and death. The sound of footsteps on the stairs leading to the basement made the decision for her. Mrs. Raven and her accomplices were moving the children tonight under cover of darkness, which meant Mary had only hours to act before the evidence of their current crimes disappeared forever. Just when we think we've seen the depths of human cruelty, stories like Raven Hill remind us that some people view suffering not as a tragedy to prevent, but as an opportunity to profit. If this investigation into America's hidden industrial horrors is compelling you to learn more, please give this video a like and share it with someone who appreciates dark historical mysteries. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our deep dives into the stories that shaped our nation's past. Now, let's discover how Mary Sullivan's desperate gamble to save the children would unfold. Mary Sullivan's decision to act that night would determine not only her own fate, but the lives of 6 children who were scheduled to disappear from Raven Hill forever. With the stolen documents hidden in her medical bag, she made her way through the orphanage's darkened corridors toward the basement chambers where the children were being held. The narrow staircase that led to the hidden cells was illuminated by lamplight from below, and Mary could hear Mrs. Raven's voice giving instructions to the men who had come to collect their human cargo. "The factory supervisors want them delivered before dawn," she was saying. "Make sure they understand that any attempt to run or cry out will result in severe punishment." Mary reached the bottom of the stairs and found herself looking at a scene that would haunt her for the rest of her life. 6 children, ranging in age from 7 to 12, sat huddled together in one of the larger cells. Their faces showed the hollow-eyed exhaustion of young people who had given up hope, but also a terrible understanding of what awaited them. Mrs. Raven stood nearby with 2 men Mary recognized from the correspondence as representatives of mills in Pawtucket and Central Falls. They were examining the children like buyers at a livestock auction, commenting on their size, apparent health, and suitability for different types of factory work. "This one's perfect for the spinning room," one of the men said, pointing to a small girl who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. "Small enough to crawl under the machines when they jam, but old enough to work a full shift without constant supervision." Mary felt a rage building inside her that overwhelmed her fear. She stepped into the lamplight and spoke with the authority she didn't know she possessed. "Step away from those children, immediately." The effect of her sudden appearance was immediate and dramatic. Mrs. Raven spun around with an expression of fury and shock, while the 2 mill representatives reached instinctively for what Mary assumed were weapons concealed in their coats. "Miss Sullivan," Mrs. Raven said, her voice carrying a deadly calm, "I'm afraid you've seen something that makes it impossible for you to continue your employment here, or anywhere else for that matter." But Mary had anticipated this moment and prepared for it. From her medical bag, she withdrew not just the documents she had stolen, but also a small revolver she had purchased days earlier when she first realized the danger she was in. "I have copies of your sales ledger, your correspondence with mill owners, and the death certificates for the children you've had murdered," Mary announced. "Those documents are already in the hands of people who will ensure they reach the Providence Police Department if anything happens to me or these children." It was a bluff. Mary had not yet had time to make copies or contact anyone outside the orphanage, but it was delivered with sufficient conviction to give Mrs. Raven pause. The older woman's eyes narrowed as she calculated the risk of Mary's claims being true. "You have no idea what you're interfering with," Mrs. Raven said. "This operation involves some of the most powerful men in Rhode Island. Mill owners, city officials, even judges. You cannot possibly imagine the consequences of crossing them." I can imagine the consequences of allowing you to continue selling children into slavery and murder," Mary replied. "And I've decided I can live with those consequences better than I can live with staying silent." The standoff continued for several tense minutes, with neither side certain how to proceed. The children watched in silent terror, while the mill representatives seemed increasingly nervous about being present during what had become a criminal confrontation. Finally, Mrs. Raven made her decision. "Kill her," she ordered the 2 men. "Make it look like an accident, and we'll proceed with the original plan for the children." But Mary had spent her weeks at Raven Hill not just gathering evidence, but also preparing for this moment. As the men moved toward her, she fired a warning shot into the ceiling and shouted at the top of her lungs, a predetermined signal for help that she had arranged with the only person in Providence she had trusted with her suspicions. The sound of Mary's gunshot echoed through the basement chambers of Raven Hill Orphanage, but it was quickly followed by a much more significant sound, the splintering of wood as the building's front door was forced open by men carrying official authority. Detective Thomas Morrison of the Providence Police Department had been conducting his own quiet investigation into rumors about Raven Hill for several weeks. Mary's contact with him 3 days earlier, along with the preliminary evidence she had shared, had convinced him to organize a raid on the orphanage. Her signal shot had been the confirmation he needed that the operation was taking place as scheduled. Mrs. Raven and her accomplices found themselves surrounded by police officers in the basement chambers, with the 6 children serving as living evidence of the crimes that had been taking place. The documents Mary had stolen provided investigators with a roadmap to the entire network of mill owners, supervisors, and officials who had participated in the systematic exploitation of children. The subsequent investigation revealed the full scope of the horror that had been operating under the guise of charitable child care. Over the course of 10 years, Mrs. Raven had sold at least 247 children to textile mills throughout New England. The children had been forced to work in conditions that amounted to slavery, with many dying from industrial accidents, disease, or deliberate murder when they became inconvenient to their owners. The trial of Agnes Raven and her co-conspirators became one of the most sensational criminal cases in Rhode Island's history. Testimony from surviving children, many of whom had been located in mill compounds throughout the region, painted a picture of systematic cruelty that shocked even veteran court observers. Mill owners who had purchased children faced charges ranging from child endangerment to accessory to murder. Mrs. Raven herself showed no remorse during the trial, maintaining that she had been providing children with opportunities for employment and education that they would never have received otherwise. Her cold indifference to the suffering she had caused made her one of the most hated figures in Providence's history. The ledger book that Mary had discovered became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Each entry represented not just a financial transaction, but a young life that had been commodified and destroyed for profit. The final tally showed that Mrs. Raven had earned over $12,000 from the sale of children, money that had been used to maintain her comfortable lifestyle while the children she sold lived and died in industrial hell. Agnes Raven was ultimately sentenced to life imprisonment, while several of the mill owners received lengthy prison terms. The scandal led to significant reforms in how orphanages were monitored and regulated throughout New England, though critics argued that the changes came too late for the hundreds of children who had already been sacrificed to industrial greed. Mary Sullivan continued her nursing career in Providence, but she never forgot the children she had been unable to save. She established a fund to provide medical care and education for survivors of the Raven Hill operation, and she spent the rest of her life advocating for stronger protections for vulnerable children. The Raven Hill Orphanage building was demolished in 1888, but not before investigators had discovered the unmarked graves of dozens of children in the property's backgrounds. Each grave contained the remains of a child who had been murdered when they became too sick, too injured, or too rebellious to continue working in the mills. This mystery reveals how easily society's most vulnerable can become victims of those who view human suffering as nothing more than a business opportunity. What do you think about this story? Do you believe all the perpetrators faced appropriate justice? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this investigation into America's industrial horrors compelling, subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates dark historical mysteries. Until next time, remember that the past holds lessons we ignore at our own peril.